New York City recorded 58 degrees Celsius at 3 a.m. on Wednesday. But that was just the beginning of a temperature spike that would raise Earth's average temperature by 30 degrees in 5 days, and make most of the planet uninhabitable for human life. This is the story of how our atmosphere turned against us. My name is Dr. James Mitchell. I'm speaking to you from a geothermal research facility buried 800 meters beneath the Norwegian permafrost, one of the last places on Earth where the temperature remains stable, no matter what's happening above. I've been a climate scientist for 23 years, and everything I'm about to tell you defies every model, every prediction, every assumption we ever made about how fast our planet could change. We were wrong about everything. And by the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. The anomaly began 6 weeks before the heat wave, though none of us recognized it for what it was. Research stations monitoring the thermohaline circulation in the North Atlantic started detecting strange fluctuations in deep ocean currents, patterns that didn't match any known seasonal cycle. The Gulf Stream, the massive river of warm water that flows from the Caribbean toward northern Europe, regulating the climate for half the northern hemisphere, had started to behave irrationally. Dr. Catherine Rodriguez was the first to see it. She was analyzing data from automated buoys positioned along the Gulf Stream's path when she noticed something that should have been impossible. The current's temperature wasn't rising steadily. It was pulsing, waves of heat surging through the water like electric charges through a wire. Each pulse raised temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees for 40 minutes, then dropped, only to climb higher with every new wave. At first, she suspected faulty sensors, but research vessels confirmed the same data. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the vast conveyor belt that moves warm and cold water across the globe, was accelerating. And that shouldn't have been possible. This system, which for millennia has stabilized Earth's climate by carrying tropical heat toward the poles, was now speeding up, driven by something we couldn't yet explain. The clue came 3 weeks before the heat wave began. Satellite thermal scans revealed massive methane releases from the Arctic Ocean floor near Svalbard, methane that had been trapped for millions of years in ice-like structures called clathrates. These frozen hydrates hold more carbon than all the fossil fuels ever burned by humanity. They'd been stable under immense pressure and cold, until something shifted. The methane wasn't trickling out, it was erupting, shooting to the surface in colossal plumes that vented straight into the air. And methane, molecule for molecule, traps 86 times more heat than carbon dioxide. We were watching gigatons of it escape every single day. But the real catastrophe wasn't what the methane was doing in the atmosphere. It was what it was doing in the oceans. When methane hydrates broke apart, they absorbed enormous amounts of heat from the surrounding water, briefly creating cold spots on the sea floor. But as the methane oxidized, that reaction released heat back into the water, an even greater amount. The oceans were being injected with thermal energy from below, and that heat was spreading through global currents like blood through arteries. 2 weeks later, the Pacific Ocean began to show the same symptoms. Hydrothermal vents along the East Pacific Rise, volcanic systems that usually release steady, predictable heat, suddenly flared to life. The seafloor spreading zones, where tectonic plates pull apart, were radiating heat at levels geologists couldn't explain. Dr. Robert Chin, analyzing seismic patterns along the Pacific Plate, noticed stress signals deep within the mantle. Earth's interior, still glowing from its ancient formation, was venting energy through cracks that had been dormant for ages. Magma chambers beneath ocean ridges were surging upward, transferring that heat into seawater, feeding the oceans from within. At first, we didn't realize the connection. The oceans, with their immense thermal mass, normally act as Earth's buffer, absorbing heat, smoothing out change. But this was different. The oceans weren't absorbing energy, they were amplifying it. Methane release drove warming. Warming drove more methane release, and the cycle accelerated. The first surface anomalies appeared along coastlines where those hot currents brushed against land. In Miami, one January night, the temperature never dropped below 38 degrees Celsius, shattering every known record during what should have been winter. Meteorologists blamed an unusual pressure system, but the heat wasn't coming from the air. It was radiating from below, from an ocean 15 degrees hotter than normal. Within 72 hours, the pattern spread worldwide. Tokyo hit 42 degrees, Sydney reached 44, Mumbai soared past 51, and these weren't daytime highs. They were nighttime readings, hours after sunset, when the planet should have been cooling. Weather models couldn't keep up. By the time forecasts were published, reality had already surpassed them. Panic rippled through the scientific community. 5 days before New York's 3 a.m. temperature hit 58 degrees, climatologists from 30 nations held an emergency video conference. The data was unanimous. The planet was undergoing a runaway thermal event unlike anything in recorded or geological history. The terrifying part wasn't just the heat, it was the speed. We were watching global temperatures climb by whole degrees in a single day. Dr. Amanda Peterson from MIT explained the mechanism. The surge in atmospheric methane had created what she called a thermal blanket, a barrier trapping infrared radiation that could no longer escape to space. Normally, Earth's heat disperses through air movement and convection, but the pace of input now exceeded what the atmosphere could redistribute. The lower layers heated faster than the upper ones, forming a deadly inversion that locked the warmth in place. And the oceans made it worse. As their surfaces grew hotter, evaporation skyrocketed, pumping more water vapor, a potent greenhouse gas, into the air. That water vapor trapped even more heat, which raised temperatures further, which caused more evaporation. It was a feedback loop without mercy. Each turn of the cycle faster, hotter, more devastating than the last. And it all began with a few pulses of heat in the deep Atlantic that no one recognized in time. The atmosphere's water vapor content had risen by 30% in just 2 weeks, a transformation that should have taken decades. It was rewriting the weather itself. Storm systems began forming in patterns that no meteorological model could explain. Hurricanes erupted in both the Atlantic and Pacific, breaking every known law of tropical formation. These weren't ordinary cyclones. They were thermal monsters, born in winter, spinning up in hours instead of days, reaching Category 5 intensity within minutes, and refusing to weaken over land because the temperature difference that usually drains their strength had vanished. Miami was ordered to evacuate on a Tuesday morning after a storm appeared 60 miles offshore. It intensified from a tropical depression to a Category 5 hurricane in 47 minutes, a statistic that might have been fascinating if it hadn't been instantly fatal. When it made landfall, sustained winds reached 185 miles per hour. But the true terror wasn't the wind, it was the heat. Air inside the eye wall measured 54 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause heat stroke in minutes and death in less than an hour for anyone exposed. The evacuation revealed just how unprepared civilization was for heat of this magnitude. Highways became corridors of death as engines overheated and air conditioners failed. Inside their cars, people baked alive as cabin temperatures soared past survivable limits. Traffic jams on Interstate 95 turned into mass casualty zones, as drivers abandoned vehicles that had become steel coffins, only to collapse within minutes of stepping outside into air nearly as hot as their own blood. Hospitals in every major city were overwhelmed. Patients poured in faster than emergency rooms could triage them, victims of heat stroke, dehydration, organ failure. Medical teams fought to save lives in environments that were barely survivable themselves, as cooling systems struggled against temperatures their designs had never anticipated. Some facilities lost power entirely when electrical grids melted under the strain. Evacuating intensive care units became impossible. For those too sick to move, the loss of air conditioning meant a quiet, inescapable death. By noon on Tuesday, New York City hit 45 degrees Celsius. Forecasts warned of worse to come as the thermal wave pushed inland. The city's infrastructure, built for a temperature range between -20 and 40, began collapsing under the stress. Subway tunnels turned into heat traps, their concrete walls radiating back the warmth they absorbed. Temperatures underground passed 60 degrees. Trains stopped running as tracks warped and electronics failed. Bridges and tunnels became choke points of chaos. The George Washington Bridge, its steel girders expanding in the heat, buckled under the strain. Roadways twisted and cracked. Traffic ground to a halt, then stopped altogether. Engines died. Air conditioning failed. 20,000 people perished there, trapped in vehicles that turned into solar ovens under a merciless sun. Central Park became a desperate refuge for those escaping burning buildings. But the trees themselves were dying, leaves withering and falling as their internal structures failed. The shade vanished, leaving people exposed to direct sunlight that seared skin to the bone within minutes. By Wednesday morning, New York had reached 52 degrees, and it was still rising. The feedback loops driving the heat were accelerating, compounding one another. What we saw in coastal cities was only the beginning. The wave was spreading inland, toward regions that had never faced temperatures like this and had no means to survive them. The models, our last remaining tools, offered no comfort. Within 5 days, they warned, the planet's average temperature would rise by 30 degrees, rendering most of Earth uninhabitable for human life. The National Weather Service issued one final report before its systems went dark. It warned that the heat would continue to intensify, faster and faster. But the true horror wasn't in the numbers. It was the realization that the same delicate balance of ocean and atmosphere that had sustained life for millions of years could unravel in weeks. And once it began, there was no force on Earth capable of stopping it. By Wednesday afternoon, cities were transforming into open-air crematoriums, but the nightmare deepened when people understood the truth. This wasn't a passing heat wave. It was permanent. The atmosphere itself had changed, and it was still getting hotter. When the sun set over New York that evening, the temperature stood at 61 degrees Celsius. The city that never slept had become the city where sleep meant death. In air hotter than blood, the human body could no longer cool itself. From my bunker deep beneath the Norwegian permafrost, I watched the thermal satellite feeds in disbelief. The entire planet glowed red and infrared, oceans boiling, continents burning, heat radiating from every surface. The seas shimmered like steaming kettles. Coastal cities appeared as blinding white scars on the planet's surface. Nightfall offered no reprieve. The heat no longer ebbed with darkness. The atmosphere was holding everything we produced, every joule of trapped energy, like a sealed furnace. Refugee columns stretched for hundreds of miles inland, endless lines of people fleeing a heat that followed them wherever they went. Highways turned into graveyards of abandoned cars, each marking the end of another family's journey. Fuel gone, water gone, strength gone. Emergency services stopped responding. There was no one left to respond. By Wednesday night, Phoenix, Arizona became the hottest place on Earth. 68 degrees Celsius. A city that had always lived with heat now faced air too hot to breathe. The superheated atmosphere scalded lungs, killing even those with shelter, water, and shade. Cooling centers, malls, auditoriums, schools became death traps when the grid collapsed under unprecedented demand. Even Phoenix's power plants, engineered for desert extremes, began to fail as cooling water reached temperatures that made heat transfer impossible. Without electricity, buildings that once offered safety became ovens of concrete and glass, trapping the radiant heat of thousands of bodies. Las Vegas soon followed. Its vast casino complexes, once sealed oases of artificial climate control, succumbed when the grid overloaded and failed. Millions of air conditioners, all straining at once, pushed the system past the point of recovery. The lights went out, and with them, the last illusion of control vanished. The famous Las Vegas Strip went dark, not from any planned shutdown, but because transformers were literally melting, their copper coils liquefying under electrical currents that exceeded their thermal limits. Tourists who had arrived to gamble and escape reality suddenly found themselves trapped in rooms where temperatures climbed past 50 degrees within hours of losing power. The desert cities were the first to die, not because of any moral failing, but because they had the least water and the most heat to begin with. Yet what came next was even more devastating. The inland cities, unaccustomed to extremes and utterly unprepared, were about to discover that ignorance was deadlier than geography. Chicago, built for brutal winters rather than unrelenting heat, began to crumble beneath temperatures that turned the heart of America into a heat-death zone. Survival now depended on resources most people didn't have. The city's infrastructure began to collapse in a chain reaction of failures. Water systems powered by vast networks of electric pumps stopped working when power plants shut down to avoid catastrophic overheating. Residents turned their taps and found nothing, or worse, scalding water that burned their hands, drawn from underground pipes that had absorbed the ambient heat of the earth. Even Lake Michigan, once Chicago's shield against temperature extremes, betrayed the city. Its waters warmed faster than the air, absorbing relentless solar radiation and thermal runoff from connected rivers. The surface temperature reached 38 degrees Celsius, too hot to offer relief, hot enough to raise body temperatures instead of lowering them. The beaches that should have been crowded with people seeking refuge stood eerily empty, the water shimmering like molten glass under a dying sun. In Detroit, factories that had defined the city for generations fell silent. Foundries and assembly lines designed to tolerate the heat of molten steel became uninhabitable when external air added to the inferno within. Workers stopped showing up, not out of rebellion, but out of self-preservation. The auto industry, once the symbol of American progress, ended in a single day when human survival outweighed the call of production. Beyond the cities, the agricultural heartland, the source of food for hundreds of millions, was collapsing even faster. Cornfields in Iowa and Illinois, which should have been greening with early growth, were instead burning where they stood, the air itself igniting dry stalks as temperatures passed the combustion point of plant material. Wheat fields in Kansas burst into spontaneous flame when heat and drought conspired to make fire inevitable. Counties vanished beneath walls of smoke and ash. Livestock died by the millions. Cattle, creatures built for cold winters but not furnace summers, dropped where they stood, their bodies overwhelmed by heat their physiology couldn't counter. The stench of decay filled the plains as carcasses decomposed in the oppressive heat, feeding swarms of insects and bacteria multiplying at terrifying speed. Chicken farms lost entire populations in hours as ventilation systems failed, barns transforming into industrial ovens that cooked their contents alive. The collapse of the food system wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous. Days, not years. In Texas, the backbone of the energy network began to fail. Refineries that turned crude oil into the fuel of civilization shut down as their cooling systems failed to dissipate heat. They relied on vast quantities of water to regulate temperatures during refining. But when that water entered the system already at 40 degrees, it could no longer do its job. Pressure built, valves ruptured, explosions ripped through refinery complexes, fireballs rising into skies so hot they barely made a difference. The Texas power grid, once a symbol of independence and reliability, collapsed entirely by Thursday morning. Demand had outpaced generation beyond any conceivable limit. Natural gas plants shut down when compressor stations lost electricity. Wind turbines froze in still air, their sensors shutting them down before their blades warped and cracked in the heat. Solar panels, meant to thrive under sunlight, lost efficiency as their own surfaces overheated, creating the cruel paradox that the hottest day in human history was also the least productive for solar power. That collapse sent shockwaves through the entire continent. Texas supplied much of the nation's fuel: gasoline for cars, diesel for trucks, jet fuel for aircraft. When the refineries failed, the supply didn't just falter, it vanished. Gas stations ran dry within hours. Panic spread faster than fire. People fought over the last drops of fuel, gunfire echoing in service stations as tempers boiled in the unbearable heat. By Thursday afternoon, most of the continental United States was baking above 55 degrees Celsius. The heat didn't fall evenly. Some regions, mountain valleys and high plateaus, remained 10 degrees cooler, just enough to allow a flicker of survival. Millions began fleeing toward higher elevations, climbing toward the Rockies as though altitude itself could offer salvation. But hiking in that heat was suicide. The human body was never meant to labor in air that seared the lungs. The Rocky Mountains became humanity's final refuge. Denver, once a city of 1 million, swelled to 10 times that size in 3 days. Refugees poured in from every direction, overwhelming water supplies, choking streets, exhausting every resource. The thin mountain air was cooler, yes, but it offered no escape from hunger, thirst, or disease. Sanitation systems failed. Fresh water vanished. The cooler air meant nothing when starvation and infection followed close behind. Hospitals everywhere collapsed under the weight of the dying. Emergency rooms overflowed with patients suffering from heat stroke, organ failure, dehydration. Doctors worked until they collapsed themselves, torn between duty and the instinct to protect their families. Many simply stopped coming to work. Parking lots became triage centers where desperate physicians decided who might live and who wouldn't. Ethical lines erased by necessity. The heat killed in ways few had ever imagined. The human body maintains its core temperature at 37 degrees Celsius by radiating heat and sweating. But when the air outside climbs above that point, those defenses become weapons against us. Every breath seared the lungs. Every touch burned the skin. Sweat no longer evaporated. It clung uselessly, turning skin slick and suffocating. In air thick with humidity from boiling oceans, evaporation was impossible. The most vulnerable fell first: the elderly, the children. But even the strong, the trained, the young began to die within hours. Bodies shut down, cells overheated, organs failed. Endurance no longer mattered. Olympic athletes collapsed alongside office workers. Marathon runners fell after 100 meters. Construction crews, soldiers, rescue teams, all perished when their vehicles ran out of fuel and their cooling systems failed. Fitness meant nothing in a world where the very air had turned against us. The heat was no longer just killing through direct exposure. It was killing through everything it touched, through the collapse of the systems that made modern life possible. Asphalt streets liquefied beneath the relentless sun, softening into pools of black tar that clung to tires, trapping vehicles where they stood. Pavement shimmered like molten glass, swallowing shoes whole and radiating heat so intense that walking became impossible. Rail lines twisted and bowed, their steel frames expanding until trains derailed mid-journey, cutting off the last escape routes that might have carried survivors to safety. Even the skies turned hostile. Airport runways warped and cracked, the tarmac buckling under temperatures that made takeoffs and landings acts of suicide. Aircraft grounded in endless rows shimmered in the heat haze, useless metal shells on a planet too hot to fly from. Pilots who might once have braved storms refused to face turbulence unlike anything ever recorded. Air currents so violent and unstable that flight itself had become a gamble with physics. Then came the night, or what used to be night. Thursday evening brought no relief. The sunset glowed crimson, not from beauty, but from a sky thick with dust and vaporized earth. The air, heavy with stored heat, refused to cool. The atmosphere had become a furnace, radiating the energy it had absorbed all day back down to the surface. Midnight temperatures stayed above 50 degrees across most of the continent. For the first time in human history, darkness no longer meant rest. People who had spent the day huddled in basements or subway tunnels stepped outside in desperate hope of cooler air, and found none. The night offered no mercy, no pause, only an endless continuation of suffering. The realization that the world would not cool again spread like contagion. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Hope began to die before the people did. Suicide rates exploded. Some chose a quick end over the slow agony of heat stroke. Families made impossible choices in moments of despair, parents shielding their children from suffering the only way they could. Gunshots echoed through cities gone silent. It was no longer just the death of bodies. It was the death of faith, of the fundamental human belief that endurance leads to survival. For the first time, the species understood that this time there would be no recovery, no morning after, and I can see it all unfolding in real time. Satellite readings show ocean temperatures still rising, methane levels in the atmosphere climbing, feeding a feedback loop that shows no sign of slowing. The data is merciless. Friday's forecast predicts temperatures exceeding 60 degrees Celsius across most inhabited regions, with pockets reaching 65 or even 70. At that threshold, life as we know it ceases to function. Not because of lack of will or strength, but because the very physics of heat exchange makes survival impossible. Even our technology, the armor we built around ourselves, began to fail. Cooling systems, air conditioners, power grids, they all relied on ambient conditions that could no longer exist. Machines overheated, circuits fried, plastic melted. The technology meant to preserve life was now dying alongside it. The heat wave that had started at the coasts was now devouring the planet. It was no longer a climate emergency. It was an extinction event, one happening too fast for biology to adapt, too vast for any nation to escape, and too extreme for even our greatest technologies to resist. Civilization had been built on the quiet assumption that the climate would always remain stable enough for food, shelter, and progress. But that assumption had expired. 8 billion human beings were discovering a truth that no one had wanted to believe. Survival is not a right granted by intelligence or invention. It is a privilege extended by the environment, and that privilege was now being revoked permanently. Friday morning arrived like an executioner. The air outside made Thursday's heat seem almost bearable by comparison. The last flickers of human communication, broken radio signals, fading internet feeds, carried a single terrifying consensus. The surface of Earth had 48 hours left before it became uninhabitable for all mammalian life. Europe, which had been spared the first wave by latitude and ocean currents, was now collapsing faster than the tropics. The Arctic Ocean, once a shield of ice, was venting stored heat like a broken furnace. London recorded 59 degrees at dawn, a number that, weeks earlier, would have been dismissed as impossible. The Thames boiled like a kettle, steam rising from its surface as the water temperature reached 42 degrees and climbing. The North Sea, hotter than any recorded ocean on Earth, was forcing thermal tides upstream, turning the river from lifeline to weapon. The city that had thrived for 2,000 years beside its banks now found itself suffocating from its own geography. The British government had retreated underground days earlier, seeking refuge in fortified bunkers beneath the Scottish Highlands. But now there was silence. No transmissions, no signals, no proof of life. Whether the quiet meant loss of power or the end of the people themselves, no one knew. The result was the same. There was no authority left, no organized response, no illusion that humanity was still in control. Paris greeted its final sunrise as a living city that Friday morning. Temperatures exceeded 60 degrees, and the last fragments of its power grid disintegrated under the crushing demand of millions turning on every device they owned in futile defiance of nature. The Eiffel Tower glowed red on thermal imaging, its iron frame absorbing the heat of the air around it. The structure itself had become a monument to our extinction, beautiful, defiant, and dying. Tourists who had once gazed at the skyline from its upper decks were now trapped there, their bodies unrecognizable in the heat that had turned observation platforms into ovens. Across the city, the Louvre's climate control systems failed. Centuries of art, the very soul of human culture, began to decay in hours. The Mona Lisa's wooden panel warped, the paint cracked and peeled, moisture tearing through the layers faster than restoration could ever reverse. Curators who had stayed to protect humanity's greatest treasures were dying alongside them. Their final acts not screams, but gestures, carrying canvases down to basements, praying that a few more hours of cooler air might preserve something of who we were. In Germany, the industrial heart of Europe began to melt, literally. Machinery built for precision and endurance failed in the face of overwhelming heat. Steel mills in the Ruhr Valley shut down as furnaces spun out of control, unable to distinguish internal heat from the inferno outside. Chemical plants triggered emergency shutdowns, but the systems designed to cool them needed electricity and water, both gone. The Rhine, once Europe's commercial artery, was now too hot for fish, too shallow for ships. Evaporation had outpaced the meltwater feeding it. Barges that had carried goods for generations sat beached on cracked riverbeds, blocking the very routes refugees tried to use to reach the mountains. Switzerland's alpine valleys became the last refuge for millions. The mountains, long symbols of stability, were now heating faster than anyone predicted. The thinner air at high elevation absorbed radiation more efficiently, making the peaks burn from above, while the valleys filled with desperate humanity. Zurich sweltered at 58 degrees, and even at 2,000 meters, the air was 45, cooler but still deadly for the weak, the old, the young. The Alps, once sanctuaries of peace and purity, had become war zones of survival. Refugees brought nothing but the clothes they wore, and desperation made them dangerous. Further south, Italy faced the worst of all. The Mediterranean, shallow, enclosed, and sun-baked, was now the planet's largest cauldron. Surface temperatures soared past 38 degrees, driving evaporation rates that thickened the air with water vapor and magnified the greenhouse effect in a runaway loop. Rome's ancient stones, the temples, the arches, the columns that had endured for millennia, began to fracture. Limestone expanded, marble split, sculptures crumbled. The Vatican itself was evacuating as hairline fractures spread across the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. But one man stayed behind. Pope Francis refused to leave. His final broadcast, transmitted from a chapel growing hotter by the hour, was not a plea for salvation, but a prayer for forgiveness, a message to a world that had ignored every warning until the last breath of its own creation. Pray for mercy. Forgive those you've wronged, and prepare to meet God, because human existence on earth was ending. Those words echoed across dying airwaves as the last broadcasters clung to failing transmitters. Each hour, fewer and fewer people heard them. But for those who did, faith became the final refuge when science no longer offered answers. Spiritual comfort replaced technological control, and people began to understand that humanity's last moments would be spent not in defiance, but in surrender. Scandinavia, a region once seen as Earth's final sanctuary from climate collapse, was falling into the same inferno. Its northern proximity should have granted it time, a grace period before the inevitable. Instead, the Arctic Ocean had turned into the planet's furnace, the very heart of the heat surge. The Norwegian Sea, once icy even in summer, was now warmer than the Mediterranean had been just a year before. In Oslo, thermometers hit 55 degrees Celsius before noon, and were climbing by 3 degrees every hour as scalding water from the north poured south through broken oceanic arteries. Across Russia, the world's largest landmass was fracturing under thermal chaos. The uneven heating created violent temperature gradients that unleashed winds beyond anything in meteorological record. Moscow simmered at 58 degrees, while Siberian towns far to the north struggled under 50 degrees, and the clash between hot and hotter birthed hurricane-force gusts over 100 miles per hour. These were not winds in the traditional sense. They were walls of flame-filled air, so blistering that a single breath could burn lungs. Even where temperatures might have been marginally survivable, the superheated gusts made outdoor existence impossible. The Siberian permafrost, frozen soil that had sealed ancient life in ice for millennia, was melting faster than anyone had feared. Within its depths lay organic matter and trapped methane, and as it thawed, those gases poured into the atmosphere, intensifying the feedback loop that was already unstoppable. This wasn't the deep ocean methane that had triggered the catastrophe. This was a second wave, land-based, immediate, and exponentially worse. Ancient bacteria and viruses, frozen since before civilization began, were being released into the air, but it hardly mattered. Disease couldn't compete with the speed of heat-induced death. In China, the world's most populous nation responded with characteristic precision and brutality. The government had begun forced evacuations of its coastal provinces 3 days earlier, relocating over 400 million people inland, using railways and highways under military control. Resistance meant execution. The objective was survival through sacrifice, save as many as possible by abandoning whoever slowed the movement. It was efficient, and efficiency meant millions dead instead of hundreds of millions. Beijing had been abandoned by the nation's leadership, who retreated into deep mountain bunkers built for nuclear war, not climate annihilation. The underground systems were designed to withstand bombs, not centuries of heat. Their air conditioning could handle temporary surges, but this wasn't temporary. As temperatures climbed relentlessly, even the mountains themselves began to radiate heat, and the shelters turned into slow-cooking tombs. It was a final lesson. You can't hide from the atmosphere when the atmosphere itself is burning. Shanghai's evacuation had become the largest human migration in history. 25 million people fled inland in a single desperate wave, turning highways into rivers of humanity. But the exodus didn't last long. When engines failed and fuel supplies ran out, the evacuation became a death march. Vehicles melted into the tarmac, and the roads turned into corridors of abandonment. Endless trails of suitcases, children's toys, water bottles, and bodies. Those who fell behind were left where they dropped. India's 1.4 billion people were now enduring an uncountable tragedy. The Ganges River Valley, once a cradle of civilization, was registering temperatures of 65 degrees Celsius, a level where human life could not continue. The government's authority had dissolved under the sheer scale of collapse. Without communication or central coordination, each region acted on instinct. Some organized desperate evacuations toward the Himalayas. Others descended into chaos, fighting for water, for shade, for a few more minutes of breath. And many went silent entirely, their populations erased faster than anyone could record. The Himalayas themselves, symbols of permanence and endurance, had become a final refuge. Yet even here, death waited at every altitude. At base camps, temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, while peaks above 7,000 meters still held sub-zero cold. Between them was a narrow band of survival, just a few thousand meters wide, and millions were trying to climb into it. Mountain passes built for small expeditions now carried human rivers. But heat and altitude sickness were a fatal combination. Trails became graveyards, marked by abandoned packs and frozen hands reaching for higher ground that would never be reached. Japan's island geography turned isolation into imprisonment. When ferry systems failed and fuel supplies vanished, there was nowhere to run. Tokyo's 38 million residents were trapped in a heat bubble where air temperatures exceeded 60 degrees Celsius, and the ocean, now a 40 degrees bath, offered no relief. For days, Japanese discipline and order held strong. People queued for water, obeyed instructions, prayed quietly. But even the most obedient society breaks under temperatures that boil blood. As the city's infrastructure disintegrated, panic finally replaced order. Mount Fuji, once a symbol of serene beauty and spiritual strength, had become a mountain of desperation. Hundreds of thousands began climbing toward its cooler summit, believing altitude might save them. The trails, designed for peaceful pilgrims, became rivers of chaos. People were crushed, suffocated, or pushed from the cliffs by crowds behind them. At the top, where it was just under 30 degrees, survival still required a climb that killed more than it saved. And far to the south, Australia was already gone. The outback, long considered Earth's harshest landscape, had crossed 75 degrees Celsius, a temperature no complex life could endure. The great cities along the coast weren't far behind. Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, each was baking in the mid-60s, their grids silent, their lights gone out. Even the oceans had turned hostile. Beachfronts were deserted because the sea itself had become dangerous, the water hot enough to burn skin. Tasmania had been humanity's last hope in the southern hemisphere, a planned refuge because of its latitude and oceanic winds. But those same winds were now blowing heat southward faster than predicted. Temperatures on the island soared past 55 degrees Celsius, transforming its green hills into brown wastelands. Designed to house 500,000 people, Tasmania was choking under 10 times that number, its infrastructure collapsing as millions fought for shade, water, and power that no longer existed. And then there was Africa, the continent that had done the least to create the crisis but was suffering its worst horrors. The Sahara Desert had grown overnight, stretching hundreds of miles southward as plants withered and the soil turned to dust. Conservation zones that had reclaimed land for decades were swallowed back by heat and wind. In the desert's heart, thermometers cracked at 80 degrees Celsius. Life, any life, was no longer possible. South of the expanding dunes, the great cities of sub-Saharan Africa, Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi, were dying. Temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius burned through concrete and skin alike. Power grids, hospitals, and governments had long since failed. There were too few living to bury the dead, and so bodies remained where they fell, silent monuments to a civilization undone by its own making. The heat had stopped being a weather event. It was now a force of extinction, and it was finishing what humanity had started. The lack of cooling infrastructure, once an economic inconvenience, had now become a death sentence. In regions where air conditioners had been considered luxuries rather than necessities, homes were turning into ovens. Brick and concrete absorbed heat by day and radiated it back through the night, creating indoor temperatures far beyond the limits of human survival. Entire neighborhoods, cities, and nations that had once lived without need of artificial cooling were now suffocating under their own roofs. Across the equator, South America was descending into the same nightmare. The Amazon rainforest, the beating green heart of the planet, often called Earth's lungs, was dying. Trees that had stood since before written history were withering under relentless heat. Leaves fell in a slow, ashen rain, carpeting the forest floor with brittle decay that ignited at the slightest spark. The air, once heavy with moisture and life, had become a haze of smoke and death. The vast ecosystem that had given humanity oxygen and balance was collapsing into a tinderbox. The indigenous peoples who had called the rainforest home for thousands of years were fleeing, joining millions of refugees from coastal cities in a desperate pilgrimage toward the Andes. The mountains offered elevation, and elevation meant hope. But even that hope was fragile. The Andes, the last refuge of a dying continent, were no longer cold. Mountain towns that had once shivered under frost were now gasping under heat. La Paz, Bolivia, 3,600 meters above sea level, and once one of South America's coolest cities, was recording 48 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to kill without cooling, but mercifully less lethal than the lowlands below, where the air itself burned. The city's population had tripled in 3 days as refugees poured in from every direction, overwhelming every resource. Food ran out first, then water, then space. Survival now depended not on wealth or status, but on sheer luck. Those who escaped the heat faced starvation, disease, and chaos in streets that had become overcrowded trenches of despair. By Friday afternoon, the data coming from orbital satellites told a story that felt impossible to comprehend. Earth's average surface temperature had risen by 28 degrees Celsius in just 5 days, and the rise was accelerating. Every feedback loop that climate scientists had warned about was now fully engaged and feeding into the next. Methane release from permafrost, oceanic heat absorption, water vapor increase, ice melt. Each one amplified the others in a deadly cascade. The planet was no longer warming, it was boiling. Models projected that by Sunday, Earth's average temperature would exceed 50 degrees Celsius, rendering most of the surface uninhabitable, even for those with cooling technology. Saturday dawned as the day when humanity's last illusions of control shattered. Temperatures had crossed the final threshold, from survivable with technology to lethal regardless of intervention. The remaining communication networks carried one simple message: get underground or die. The surface of Earth was no longer a place for human life. It had become as hostile as the vacuum of space. The only difference was that here you could breathe for a few minutes before the air itself cooked you from the inside. Denver, the last major surface refuge in North America, recorded 63 degrees Celsius at dawn. The temperature was climbing by 3 degrees an hour. Its elevation, once an advantage, no longer mattered. The heat had reached the high plains and mountain valleys, filling even the thinnest air with unbearable energy. 10 million refugees had poured into the city, seeking safety that no longer existed. They filled every basement, every tunnel, every space that could be called underground. Parking garages became cities. Families claimed individual spaces as if they were lifeboats, defending them with desperate violence from others trying to squeeze in. Shopping malls became makeshift shelters, their storage areas packed shoulder to shoulder with the displaced. Subway tunnels, dark, damp, and airless, were transformed into warrens of survival, where thousands huddled together, praying the ventilation would hold. But the fans and filters that kept them alive needed power, and power was failing everywhere. As generators died and stations went dark, carbon dioxide began to build. Breath became poison. People collapsed from suffocation rather than heat. And the bodies, too many to count, couldn't be moved. Bringing them to the surface meant instant death. So the dead stayed below, decaying in the same spaces where the living still fought to breathe. Even the wealthy, sealed inside multi-million-dollar private bunkers, found that money could not buy escape. Silicon Valley executives who had invested fortunes in underground fortresses were dying alongside the poor. The Earth itself had turned against them. As the surface temperature rose, the heat began seeping downward, traveling through layers of rock and soil. The deeper you went, the slower it came, but it came nonetheless. At 100 meters below, temperatures were climbing steadily. My own facility in Norway, buried 800 meters deep, equipped with geothermal cooling systems designed to redirect natural heat, was holding at 28 degrees Celsius inside. Outside, surface temperatures were 65 degrees. We were safe for now, but we were the exception. Few bunkers on Earth were built to resist a planet that was burning from the crust upward. The oceans, once humanity's great thermal buffer, had turned traitor. They were now the planet's largest heat source. Surface temperatures across the Atlantic and Pacific had surpassed 45 degrees Celsius, transforming the seas into vast cauldrons. The evaporation rate was staggering, loading the atmosphere with so much water vapor that humidity levels were approaching 100% in many regions. This created a new, horrifying phenomenon, what meteorologists called wet bulb events. When heat and humidity combined beyond a certain point, the human body could no longer cool itself through sweat. At a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, even in the shade, even with water, death came within hours. Now, across most coastal areas, that limit had been shattered. Wet bulb readings above 40 degrees Celsius meant survival time was measured in minutes. The Caribbean islands, once icons of paradise, were now ghost archipelagos of steam and silence. The air hung thick with moisture and heat so intense it boiled water at reduced pressure. Palm trees that had lined white beaches stood blackened and skeletal, their leaves cooked away. Those who hadn't fled were gone. The islands had become open-air crematoriums. And then, to the south, the unthinkable. Antarctica, the coldest place on Earth, was thawing faster than any model had imagined possible. The frozen continent, long a fortress of ice, was now under siege from above and below. The air had warmed to near zero, and the surrounding seas were pouring heat into its edges. Rivers and lakes were forming across ice that had been solid for millions of years. The research stations, McMurdo, Amundsen Scott, Vostok, once symbols of human endurance, had become strange havens. McMurdo recorded 8 degrees Celsius, a temperature once considered impossible there. It was now one of the last places on Earth where people could live on the surface without immediate death. Scientists, once researchers, had become caretakers of refugees, pilots, sailors, and survivors who had somehow made it south before the transport systems collapsed. But even this fragile refuge was temporary. The ice was melting faster every hour. As the white surface disappeared, darker rock and water absorbed more heat, accelerating the spiral. Projections estimated that within 6 months, Antarctica would be ice-free, and within weeks after that, it would burn like everywhere else. Greenland, too, was dissolving, its glaciers feeding oceans that were rising by centimeters each day. Cities that had already been emptied by heat were now drowning beneath the swelling seas. Streets that had seen the last human footsteps days ago were now flooded graveyards, filled with drifting debris and silent buildings. For those still alive below ground near coastlines, the disaster took a new shape. Rising sea levels were pushing water tables upward, flooding bunkers and tunnels with salt water. People who had survived the heat by burrowing into the earth were now drowning in the dark. Forced to choose between suffocation, drowning, or burning, humanity was being cornered by its own planet. Only the mountains remained, jagged silhouettes rising above the haze, offering the last illusion of safety. Millions were still climbing, toward thinner air, cooler winds, and the faint, fading hope that altitude might mean survival. But as the numbers grew and the heat followed even into the clouds, it became clear. There was no up left to run to. The world that had once felt infinite had become a closed system, a pressure cooker with nowhere to vent. And for the first time in Earth's history, every living thing was facing the same truth at once. Survival was no longer a right. It was an expired privilege. The Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes. Every great mountain range on Earth had become a human exodus route. Arteries of desperation where millions were climbing toward altitude as if the air itself could still save them. Trails once used by hikers and explorers were now choked with refugees, moving upward through exhaustion that turned deadly in the heat, driven only by the primal certainty that staying low meant certain death. Mount Everest, a mountain once scaled by only a few hundred climbers each year, now held tens of thousands upon its slopes, ordinary people clawing toward the cold air that still lingered above 7,000 meters, where ice clung to the rock despite the burning planet below. But reaching that height required equipment, training, and a strength few possessed. Most were dying on the mountain, collapsed from altitude sickness, falling from cliffs, or simply stopping when their bodies could go no farther, choosing to die on the climb rather than burn below. The death toll from the heat had grown beyond counting. 2 billion lives gone in the first 5 days, based on the last fragments of data still transmitted from collapsing systems. But those were only the recorded deaths. Regions that had already gone silent likely doubled that number. Whole populations erased in hours, their final moments unseen, unrecorded, uncounted. The messages that reached my bunker grew shorter each day. Panic had given way to grim acceptance. Those underground were beginning to understand what we had refused to believe at the start. That these shelters were not sanctuaries, but waiting rooms. Food stores were vanishing faster than planned, as bodies burned through calories fighting the heat. Water systems were failing, as pumps and filters choked under loads they were never designed to handle. Air recyclers sputtered and died, their intakes clogged with the soot of a world on fire. The surface above had become a single planetary inferno. Forests, cities, and oceans were burning together. Temperatures had reached the ignition points of wood, paper, even plastic. Fire consuming everything it could touch. Normally, global smoke clouds would cool the planet by shielding it from the sun. But this time, the atmosphere was too hot, too heavy. The smoke rose, stalled, and trapped the heat below like a lid on a boiling pot. Another feedback loop, another self-feeding spiral. By Saturday evening, night no longer brought relief. For the fifth consecutive sunset, the darkness failed to cool the air. The heat of 5 endless days was now stored in the atmosphere itself, too vast to radiate away into space. Day and night had become indistinguishable, an eternal fever wrapping the planet. Across what remained of our communication lines, the last spiritual voices spoke into the static. Priests, imams, monks, rabbis, all delivering final words to followers who were dying faster than faith could comfort them. For centuries, religion had warned of judgment through divine fire. Yet now humanity faced fire born not of wrath, but of physics. The scriptures had spoken of moral punishment. The reality was thermodynamic inevitability. Faith was cracking beneath the weight of a scientific apocalypse. The last fragments of civilization dissolved underground. Cooperation gave way to competition, morality to survival. Fights broke out over space, water, food, each act of violence an echo of an ancient instinct we thought we'd evolved beyond. In the end, survival became a zero-sum game. For one person to live, another had to die. Children died first. Their small bodies absorbed heat too quickly, and their limited mass offered no buffer. Parents faced unthinkable choices: pour their last water over a child's skin, or save it for the adults who might endure a few hours longer. The elderly and the sick, once protected and prioritized, were now left behind in the dark corners of shelters. Doctors were forced to perform triage on entire populations, deciding not who to save, but who might suffer least before the end. My bunker's computers continued to calculate, cold and precise amid the chaos. Their projections showed that by Sunday, temperatures across most continents would exceed 70 degrees Celsius, and desert regions would push toward 80. At that level, the human body, no matter how hydrated or sheltered, could no longer function. Even in the shade, even with unlimited water, blood itself could not cool fast enough to sustain life. By Monday, the models said, the surface of the Earth would no longer be compatible with human biology. Only the highest mountain peaks, above 4,000 meters, and a handful of deep-cooled bunkers would remain momentarily habitable. The realization was spreading, grim and inescapable. The stable climate that had cradled humanity for millennia was never guaranteed. It was a delicate balance, and once we broke it, there was no way back. The week from Wednesday to Sunday would be remembered, if memory itself could survive, as the moment humanity finally understood that intelligence and technology were powerless against the raw laws of thermodynamics. The moment the atmosphere, our oldest protector, turned predator, when Earth itself became an alien world, hostile to the very life it had once nurtured. Sunday dawned, but the word hot had lost meaning. Heat had become something else, an all-consuming force that erased the boundary between matter and flame. The thermometer outside our facility, calibrated for geothermal extremes up to 100 degrees Celsius, failed at 11 a.m. Its sensors melted. Calculations based on thermal radiation showed that Norway, once a symbol of the Arctic's cool refuge, had reached 78 degrees. If it was nearly 80 here, equatorial regions were surpassing 90. The air itself was nearing the boiling point of life. The messages that still reached us spoke of failure. A shelter in Colorado, 800 people reduced to 200 as their cooling systems failed, the air inside rising past 48 degrees. A bunker in New Zealand sent a final video, its ventilation shaft glowing red, the metal radiating visible heat. Their leader's voice was calm as he sealed the vents, explaining they now had 6 hours of breathable air left. After that, they would suffocate together in the dark. One by one, the satellites above us flickered and died. Built to withstand the void of space, they were now being cooked from below, their circuits overwhelmed by the thermal radiation bleeding off the planet. As they went dark, the last threads of communication snapped, leaving our world truly silent for the first time in history. Inside our bunker, the temperature had climbed to 32 degrees, and rising fast. The geothermal cooling system, once our greatest safeguard, was losing the battle. The rock around us was now hotter than the coolant we circulated. There was nowhere left to dump the heat. The Earth itself was cooking from the surface down, erasing the gradients that made life and escape possible. 43 of us remained, rationing air, food, and hope as the readouts glowed red. We had enough supplies for 6 months under normal conditions, but it no longer mattered. At this rate, the planet would claim us in 3 days. The heat was coming for us. Not as a wave, but as a tide, slow and relentless. And as it crept deeper into the rock, we realized the most devastating truth of all. The Earth wasn't dying. It was resetting. It was simply returning to a state where we could no longer exist. The irony of our situation was both mathematically perfect and spiritually devastating. We had the deepest facility, the most advanced cooling systems, and the most complete stores of food and data on the planet. And yet, none of it would save us. You can't hide from heat that's rising everywhere at once. The very laws of thermodynamics that once powered our civilization were now writing its obituary. Heat flows from hot to cold, but when the entire planet is hot, there's nowhere left for it to go. Even as part of me accepted death, another part kept running calculations, documenting, analyzing, because that's what scientists do. The methane pouring from the thawing seabeds and permafrost had ignited a runaway loop. More heat released more methane, which trapped more heat, which released even more. The cycle was now self-sustaining, unstoppable, devouring itself like fire feeding on its own smoke. Water vapor followed the same merciless rhythm. Rising heat turned oceans into steam, filling the air with humidity so thick it became another greenhouse layer. Satellites showed a planet wrapped in cloud, but these weren't the cool, reflective kind that bring rain. They were superheated steam, trapping sunlight and baking the surface below. The final transmission I received came from Antarctica, the last refuge left. The research base there had swollen to 2,000 people, scientists, refugees, anyone who could make it across the melting world. Their message was calm, clinical, and final. Surface temperatures at McMurdo had passed 35 degrees Celsius. The ice sheet beneath them was collapsing, set to vanish within 30 days. They expected their own extinction within 48 hours. The station commander ended with coordinates, locations of seed vaults, genetic archives, cultural records, all stored in their freezers. He knew those freezers would soon fail, that heat would destroy everything. But he wanted someone someday to know we had tried to preserve something of ourselves. Even in the face of annihilation, humanity tried to leave a trace. I'm making this final recording because that's what I was trained to do. Observe, record, remain objective, even when the data describes your own extinction with cold precision. Our reactor cooling system is collapsing. Within 12 hours, the power will fail, air circulation will stop, and the heat will rise until we suffocate in the dark. The surface above us now measures 76 degrees. Inside the facility, it's 38, and climbing by roughly 1 degree per hour. That gives us about 6 hours before we reach temperatures no human body can endure. There are 43 of us left. We've gathered in the central chamber because dying together feels better than dying alone. And strangely, there's no panic anymore. Acceptance brings a kind of calm. We play music, share stories, whisper the things we never said when we still believed in tomorrow. Some are praying. Others just sit quietly, staring into the dim light, waiting. The heat that's killing us didn't come from nowhere. It began as natural cycles, processes older than humanity itself, that we accelerated without understanding. The planet has always changed. Ice ages, warm periods, long before we existed. But this time, it happened too fast. Evolution couldn't keep up. Neither could technology. We built our entire civilization inside a rare window of stability, and assumed that window would never close. We burned the fuels of ancient worlds, tore down forests that cooled the air, and set in motion feedback loops we didn't even recognize until it was too late. This isn't punishment, it's consequence, and consequences don't care about intentions or regret. Inside our walls, the temperature has reached 42 degrees. People are lying on the floor, searching for a last breath of cooler air. Their bodies can't shed heat fast enough anymore. We might have 2 hours left, and I'm using mine to finish this record, because that's what we do. We leave a trace. To whoever may find this, if the earth ever cools again and life returns, we were here. We built cities that touched the sky. We painted, composed, explored, and reached for the stars. We unlocked the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, and yet we failed to save ourselves. We knew what was happening. We had the knowledge to prevent it, but we lacked the will to act until there was no time left. The heat that's ending us comes from every direction, from the air above, the oceans below, and the rock beneath our feet. It comes from a planet obeying the laws we thought we mastered. The Earth doesn't care whether we exist. Physics doesn't negotiate. My final observation, as both scientist and human, is this. Intelligence alone isn't survival. Technology isn't salvation. Understanding the problem means nothing if you act only after it's too late. We were the smartest species this world ever produced, and we died anyway, killed by our own brilliance, undone by systems we created but couldn't control once they crossed the threshold. The displays now read 45 degrees. Breathing is hard. My thoughts are dissolving in the heat, but I need to say this before I can't anymore. We were human. We tried. We failed. But for a brief moment in cosmic time, we mattered. The lights are dimming. 47 degrees. People are slipping into unconsciousness. I'm going to stop recording now and join the others. We'll face the end together, hands joined, waiting for the fire we unleashed to finish what it began. This is Dr. James Mitchell, signing off from Deep Station Alpha in Norway. The temperature is 48 degrees and rising. In the beginning, we conquered fire. In the end, fire conquered us.